In order to help kids learn, there are a few assumptions that we need to make. So the first assumption is that there are skills that need to be learned before kids can learn academic skills. So the first skill is to be able to attend. If a child cannot focus, a child cannot learn. If the child is all over the map, looking everywhere, or walking and moving everywhere, then they're not going to be able to learn. So one of the very first things is that we need to teach a child how to focus. Now some kids are going to learn that automatically, great. But if they don't, we need to help them build that focus. And we can start with the smallest tidbit of focus, and we can expand it out. Okay, but we have to start wherever they're at and then grow that focus. So attend or focus. I had a little boy who was 9 years old, and I did not want to do tutoring. And he would come in and he would stomp his feet and he would cry and say he didn't want to be in tutoring. And so the very first day that he actually came in for a lesson. Initially there was the screening and all that, but the baseline data. But the first lesson he came in, his mom was traveling, so she asked me to text her at the end of the lesson and let her know how it went. And I said, well, we made it 2 minutes. And so then a couple days later he came in again, and I texted her at the end of that lesson, well, we made it 9 minutes. And you could see how you could stretch it out, right? After a few weeks, maybe a month or whatever, or 6 weeks, don't remember how long it was, but he was able to sit and focus the entire lesson without any problems. And what's really wonderful is that he started really enjoying tutoring. From the child who used to stamp his feet and fuss, to the child who would come in and say, hey, Miss Barb, we're going to do brain training today. It's really exciting. If we know what to do and how to do it, we can actually help a child develop their ability to focus. The next skill that a child needs is that they need to have memory. They need to have both visual memory and auditory memory. And visual memory comes in both the form of a spatial memory, like we talked about in a previous video, where they take pictures of things, they store things spatially. Okay, that's the spatial memory. And then they also need the sequential memory, and then they need a visual and auditory. But the visual comes in two forms. Now, kind of the rule of thumb is that a student needs to be able to remember 5 things before they can really learn phonics, begin to learn phonics. If they're doing it visually, that would be a visual digit span, or if they're doing it auditorily, that would be an auditory digit span. So why is that important? So let's take the word split. So in order to learn to read this word, they have to be able to remember 5 sounds. Sp, o, it, in order. If they can't remember 5 sounds in order, they might come up with spilt, right? And so, or some other even more random thing, but this is very understandable how they can mix this up. So if they can't sequence 5 things in order, they're not going to be able to get very far in reading or learning phonics, because they can't retain the sounds long enough to get to the end of the word and know what it is. So the rule of thumb is that that many reading specialists would go with is that they need to have a sequential memory or a digit span of at least 5, both auditorily and visually, in order to begin to learn phonics. Okay? beyond maybe the consonant vowel consonant level. And they need a digispan of 7 to master phonics. Now, typically, a student would be everything I ever read or see says that the digispan of a 5-year-old is a 5, and the digispan of a 7-year-old is a 7. I don't think it's necessary that it be quite that high. I would tend to think more in the neighborhood of a 5-year-old must at least have a digispan of 4, and a 6-year-old would need to have a digispan of 5, and so on. Now, granted, I spend my whole day with kids with learning disabilities, so maybe that's not the norm, but I find that if my 7-year-olds have a digispan of 6, they're doing fine. So if I can get them to that point, if I can build their sequential memory up to 6, that's fine. So they can remember 6 things by the time they're 7. They're going to be able to remember, they're going to be able to understand and remember the phonemic rules that they are learning. So that's the next thing that kids need. Another thing is they need to be able to discriminate sound. There's also visual discrimination, but I don't see many kids with visual discrimination issues, or at least I would put that in the category of visual perception, which is my next category. But auditory discrimination, what is that? That is the ability to hear sound and discriminate it from another sound. So the difference between d and t, or ch and t, or tr and ch. That's one that a lot of kids who have learning issues struggle with. The difference between tree and chi. They have a hard time hearing that difference. The difference between eh and I. The kids need to be able to hear those minute differences in sound in order to be able to spell, right? Especially spell, but even reading is going to take some of that, take that skill to some degree, but especially in spelling. If you're hearing the I and the eh the same way, you're going to get the wrong vowel. If you hear a TR sound as a CH sound, again, very common mistake among students with learning disabilities, then you're going to spell those words wrong, right? So we need to make sure that their auditory discrimination is strong before we try to teach them to read and spell. Visual perception, which we went over quite a bit in the last video about the VKA learner, the visual spatial learner. So visual perception is a skill that kids need. They need to be able to make sense of what they're seeing. So like if they're looking at the whiteboard, across the room with the teacher, they need to be able to see the foreground and the background. They need to be able to distinguish these letters. And I'm not talking about physically having good vision, but having their brain be able to interpret what they're seeing. That's the key. And so, and if you haven't watched that video on visual perception and the visual spatial child, that's a really important video to watch. It will help you understand visual perception, but it's basically seeing and interpreting. Same is true with auditory discrimination and perception. There's a difference between, yes, we've tested their hearing, it's fine, and what is the brain doing with the sound? Visual perception. Their vision is fine, but what is their brain doing with what they're seeing? Next one is, along with visual perception, would be other visual skills such as tracking and convergence. And I'm not going to go into convergence. I'm not going to go into what those are specifically. I'll just briefly say that with tracking, a child needs to move left to right in our society in order to read, right? So they need to be able to track, and their eyes need to be able to move along the line. And then convergence means that the two eyes need to, if you have a dot here, the two eyes need to work together to focus on that dot and for the brain to interpret what it's seeing there. Those eyes, the brain is taking the right picture, I guess might be a way to say that. And there's whole videos on convergence, and when we get to that in the training, I will link to some of those better videos. And then lastly, there is processing speed. Now, this actually goes along with the sequential visual memory, but processing speed is how fast can a child take in information and then act upon it. So as an adult, we're driving down the street and we see flashing lights ahead, and our brain sees that, and then we need to process that information. Oh, flashing lights. That means that there's an emergency vehicle ahead. Which lane is it in? Is it coming towards me? Is it moving away from me? Do I need to pull over? What is everyone else around me doing so that if I do pull over, I don't hit anyone? So that's your brain interpreting what you see. Most people can see the flashing lights, but how fast you make those judgments is your processing speed. So the child who is having a difficult time with getting their work done, they have a slow processing speed. They might be able to do it, or they might not. They might get sidetracked in the process. But they have to do it fast enough so that they can succeed, they can pass the test. So these are some of the skills that we need for learning. We need to learn these skills before we can learn. And if the child isn't picking these things up automatically, then we need to give them opportunities to build those skills. And again, because we all have strengths and weaknesses, we're probably going to be low in at least one of these areas, if not multiple areas. And the child who has disabilities, learning difficulties, is definitely going to have one or more of these areas that are weak. And it's our job as tutor, parent, teacher, specialist to help the child learn those skills. And I hope to do a video on how to help your preschooler develop these skills. I've done a class with some preschool moms, moms of preschoolers, to help them find ways to build this into their child's everyday routines so that they can be ready to learn when they get to school. Okay, the first assumption was there's skills that we need to learn before we can learn. And then the next assumption is that the skills are learned in order. So you can't learn to ride a bike if you don't have balance. You can't learn to read if you can't tell a B from a D, or you can't learn math if you can't tell a 5 from a 2, or you can't learn math you can't learn math well if you don't understand that this is 3, not that this isn't 1, 2, 3, that this is 3. So there are skills that need to be learned, kind of like bricks laying the foundation for a house, okay, or for a wall. You can't expect to put this brick in first, or this rock in first, before you put the other ones in. If you put only some of these rocks in place for this brick wall, this rock wall, and then you try to put the top brick in, it's going to fall because the foundation isn't there. And what happens is you have kids who go through, they've got some of the foundational skills in place, so they go through first grade, second grade, third grade, things are going okay. They're maybe struggling a little bit, but they're making it. And then usually around fourth grade, maybe fifth, everything comes crashing down. When you see that situation, typically what's going on, unless there's been some sort of sudden trauma that the child has experienced, usually what that means The foundation was not strong, it wasn't laid well, and the upper skills cannot hold. So they can't take notes because they've learned to read, they've learned to write, they've learned to spell, but their sequential skills weren't built strong enough to be able to take notes, or they aren't able to read fast enough because their processing speed is too slow, or they can't attend for an hour lecture when they get later, get older. So if you start seeing these skills breaking down later on, their learning breaking down later on, it's probably because the foundational skill was not in place, and they've been able to compensate up to this point. So that's the next thing. Foundational skills build upon one another, okay? Foundational skills build upon each other. You can't run until you learn to walk. You can't jump if you can't stand. So again, it's pretty basic, but it's an assumption that we need to make. And then the last assumption that I want to make is what we call the pyramid of repetition. I don't know who was the first to coin this term, the pyramid of repetition, but I heard this term first used in a book by Dr. Juan Stridham, The Right to Read. And again, I will link to this below. So this is our last point we're going to make on our assumptions. But basically, he says there's a pyramid of repetition. If someone knows if there was an earlier reference to this in other materials, let me know down in the comments. This is the assumption that we make here. The child needs to have enough repetition so they can make it their own. So the example in the book is something like, the average child needs to hear a word 400 or 500 times, I don't remember which, but they need to hear a word, say 500 times before they make it their own. So a little tiny child hears the word mama, mommy, 500 times, and then they start going mama, mama, and they start trying to imitate that sound with meaning. The next word that they learn might be ball, and so maybe they only need to hear that word, say 499 times, okay? So they don't need to hear the next word quite so often. And eventually they learn language, they start picking up language quicker and quicker, so that by the time they're preschoolish, they might hear a word only 2 times, and they start using the word with some level of appropriateness. That's amazing, and they say, oh, that's amazing, and they start using bigger words or words that they've only heard once or twice before. So that's that pyramid of repetition. The same is true like with a foreign language, and again, I give credit to Dr. Juan Stridham here for this analogy. He says, the first language other than the mother tongue takes a long time to learn. But then after we learn that first language, the second language isn't quite so hard because we've already understand the grammatical form, the conjugations, the declensions, whatever the types of forms are. So your second language is a little easier than the first, and then the next language is easier and easier. By the time you get to your 5th or 6th language, you can pick them up pretty quickly because you've got other words that you've already learned from other languages that draw upon it or that are similar, and also that the grammatical structures that are the same. So that's that pyramid of repetition, that anything can be learned, but it takes a lot of repetition in the beginning, but gets easier and easier as we learn more and more things. Now this 500 times to hear a word is for the normal child learning language. But a child who has an auditory processing problem, auditory discrimination problem, maybe a auditory sequential problem, that child with an auditory weakness might need to hear the word 1 or even 2,000 times before they make that word their own. But The key is that they can make it their own. They can learn, but they just need more repetition than other children do. So anything can be learned, but the first learning of any genre of learning is going to take a lot more, and as we learn more and more in that field, we need less and less repetition. So that is our third assumption that we're going to make before we can help children learn. There are certain skills that need to be learned before a child can learn. There are certain skills that are foundational for other skills, and we need repetition in order to learn. But that repetition decreases over time as we learn a certain type of topic. So, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please click like and maybe share it with 5 friends. Thanks a lot. See you in the next one.